I'm Kathy Magruder, and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland Clean Energy Center. Today's program is Environmental Justice in the Energy Sector. We're looking at underserved and disadvantaged communities who are front and center with new directives for the spend of public dollars dedicated to addressing and mitigating climate change impacts. Our panelists today will discuss their perspectives and offer ideas related to the challenges of broadening inclusivity for climate justice. This is the 5th program in the Connecting to the Energy Economy speaker series, and it's made possible by the support of sponsors listed on your screen. We would like to take a moment just to highlight our Voltage sponsors. Our thanks to BGE as a longtime supporter and partner of Maryland Clean Energy Center. New this year is Schneider Electric, who is supporting this series for the first time. Siemens is also a sponsor who spoke at the program last week on shifting to a zero emissions fleet. And we have special thanks going out to our returning power sponsor, CohnReznick, an award-winning advisory assurance and tax firm based in Bethesda, Maryland. We have a really dynamic panel for you today, and this topic is so important right now. As a reminder, our speakers' bios are posted online at www.mdcleanenergy.org/ej-energy/. Now I would like to introduce today's moderator, Brooke Smallwood, who is an Associate VP with Carrion. Brooke, thanks for moderating today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy. And good morning to everyone. Next slide, please. So I am Brooke Smallwood, pleased to be with all of you today. I'm the Associate Vice President at Carrion Group. My greatest accomplishment in my energy career has been that I've started and developed and implemented many different programs for Pepco and Delmarva Power in my time, starting with the CNI in energy efficiency programs back in 2009, and most recently in 2019, helped to develop and launch the EV programs across the PHI footprint. So really excited about the work that I've done in the past and excited to be an advisory member in my sophomore year at EC. In my past, I've had the pleasure of winning Energy Star Awards for the programs that I've developed. I am a former Exelon employee working with Pepco specifically, and I also did work for AltaGas when I was with WGL. So my goal in life at this point is to truly be a thought leader in energy equity, and so I'm very happy to be asked to moderate today. I'm representing Carrion. We are a woman-owned company. We have a very diverse workforce, and we have offices in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, DC, Maryland, and in Georgia. Our core services, what we're known for most is project and program management, but we also have a very strong presence in some other categories like project controls, construction management, data analytics, and risk management as well. Some of our notable clients are Exelon, that's the team that I currently support. We are supporting the Pepco reliability program, so on the transmission and distribution side of the business. We also do work for PSE&G and for Amtrak as examples. So again, thank you for having me. Next slide, please. And so when we think about energy equity, I recently saw the movie and read the book for it's called Ready Player One. Steven Spielberg was the director, and the original book was written by Ernest Cline. But this picture you see in the background here is Steven Spielberg's imagination of what the world that Ernest Cline created in his book, Ready Player One. And what's very interesting about it is this is a story about a dystopian community and world and reality, right? But it was set in 2045. That's only 20 years from now. And this book was written in 2011. And even then, Mr. Cline realized that we were facing a global energy crisis, that if we do not apply some equity, this picture right here could be the world that we're living in. And so the quote is, imagine a world where a global energy crisis has left us without cars to drive, Motor vehicles sit abandoned in junk piles and on the sides of roads because there is no more oil left to fuel them. Electricity powered by fossil fuels is no more, and the entire planet is living in a dystopian reality where basic resources are nearly unattainable, and the quality of life has severely deteriorated. No one drives on roads anymore, and the freedom of owning a car, once a staple in America, is gone. And this is the future we will face if we don't apply equity to the energy equation. And this is something that is extremely important. And when I think about applying equity, I think about the 3 A's. The first one is accountability for our business, especially for C&I and our business consumers out there who are pumping a lot of unclean air into the environment. They need to have accountability. The second A is accessibility, so that we all have access to clean energy. And the last one is affordability, because if the poorest among us cannot afford energy, then we are doing no good. And so in this book, only the richest, the 1%, had electricity. The other 99% of the world was left without energy to access. So this is a very important topic. I hope you all can go read the book or see the movie, but it's very interesting, right, of how others perceive this global energy crisis. But we're here today to talk about it, talk about the challenges, and also provide you with some solutions. Next slide, please. So we're going to do a quick poll. And the question is, what do you feel is the greatest challenge in achieving environmental justice and energy? This is a single choice. I'll give you just a little bit more time to answer, and then we'll look at the results. All right, it looks like community exclusion and marginalization, lack of awareness and education, and economic inequities are the top 3. Very interesting. Yes, and we're going to address all of that today. So let me have the pleasure of introducing our first panelist, Bernita Haynes. I apologize, Bernita. Bernita Haynes. It's all over to you.
No worries. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm Bernita Haynes. I'm a staff attorney at National Consumer Law Center. My work centers on energy affordability and access. Recently authored a paper at NCLC on air source heat pumps, actually, and how to transition people to air source heat pumps while protecting, the financial well-being of low-income families. Also worked recently with NRDC on producing a water affordability toolkit, looking at ways for folks to advocate for better water programming and things like that at their utility. Before joining NCLC, I was a director at Georgia Watch, which is a consumer watchdog organization here in Atlanta, where I'm based. We worked on a variety of issues at Georgia Watch, including energy and utility issues. Came right to that out of a career as an environmental attorney. So next slide. Just a little bit about NCLC. Since 1969, NCLC has been a real voice for consumers, especially as it relates to energy policy work, and particularly with a focus on protecting low-income and disadvantaged consumers throughout the country. Our work centers on addressing racism in our energy space and generally systemic racism, as well as advancing economic justice for everyone, in particular consumers of color. Our energy team is a pretty robust team of about, I think, 10 folks. We're one of the larger teams at NCLC, and we advocate for everything, including energy affordability for low-income folks in terms of utility programs, access to renewable clean energy that is actually affordable for low-income folks, more funding for LIHEAP and other federal programs.
Thank you, Bernita. And my question to you is, when we take a look at the challenges, right, that we just pulled on, what challenge sticks out for you as the most critical challenge we're facing today regarding equity?
Yeah, a couple of things actually. That poll was very telling, first of all, and I agree with a lot of the selections there. One thing that stands out quite a lot to me is landlord accountability issues. By that, I mean landlords are not really incentivized to do some of these energy efficiency improvements that would help reduce energy use, some of our reliance on this dirty energy, and would also help reduce utility bills. Renters are by far disproportionately low income. So the types of incentives that are necessary to actually convince landlords to buy these more efficient appliances are just lacking. Our landlords are not often weatherizing properties either. Weatherization is so important as well to reducing energy use. The more sealed the home is, the more weatherized it is, the less reliant you are on your air conditioner or your heating system. Because the landlords don't pay there. They don't live there and they don't pay the bill. So they don't really have any incentive to do that. So in the work that we do at NCOC, we focus very heavily on renters because they're kind of the low-hanging fruit in some ways in terms of reducing our energy usage and also helping people reduce their energy bills at the same time. And I'll just say as something that just happened, the DOE's new furnace efficiency rule comments just were submitted last week. It's a furnace efficiency rule for condensing furnaces. Gas furnaces that can really help reduce the heating bills for folks in colder climates, particularly by thousands of dollars a year. Their proposed rule is really great. We couldn't ask for more in their proposed rule. We've seen a lot of pushback from the industry on that proposed rule, but we're hoping that rule will actually go a long way towards incentivizing landlords to buy these and upgrade these new efficient appliances to reduce our energy use a bit. But I would say landlord accountability issues are kind of the looming barrier and problem to alleviating the energy burden and achieving environmental justice.
I'm sorry, thank you for that. Absolutely, totally agree. Now let's hear from Charmaine Brown.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for having me as part of this really important conversation today. Brooke, I have to tell you, you really moved me in the way that you framed today's conversation and the citing of the Spielberg movie. I'm Charmaine Brown. I am representing today my capacity as co-chair of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, one of 3 co-chairs, as well as the leader of the climate justice team. Next slide, please. My full-time job is Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at a company called Finance of America. I have over a decade experience in doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work in the corporate sector. I'm also president of the Finance of America Foundation, and I chair the ESG, Environmental Social Governance Committee at Finance of America. But as I said, today I'm representing the Maryland Commission on Climate as well as the CJ team, where we really strive to apply the equity lens to the work that the MCCC is doing. And so we have liaisons that represent the CJ team with the 4 working groups that the MCCC has. So we have an education and community outreach group. We have mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency, as well as science and tech. And as I say deliberately, that we strive to apply the equity lens, because since taking this role about 2 years ago, this month actually, I am recognizing how challenging it is to actually make equity real. We talk about it, and we use language that I think attempts to really understand it, but it's really tied, I think, to systems. And so we're really working hard at applying the equity lens in a way that is actionable and helps the commission to execute. We don't actually execute, the CJ team. We pretty much advise. Next slide, please. And so you all are probably aware that the Climate Solutions Now Act went into effect June 1st of this year. And it is a pretty, I think, aggressive, putting a pretty aggressive stake in the ground around what Maryland will do to address greenhouse gases and to really work to identify and define more clearly what we're talking about when we talk about overburdened and underserved communities. In addition, it really strives to also put some metrics in place to really start to measure how we're doing. Accountability has come up a couple of times today. Well, if we aren't able to measure our effectiveness, then I don't know that we can really hold anyone accountable. Next slide, please. And so what I'd like to do also is just talk a little bit about my perspective. As Brooke talked about the 3 A's, there was another A that came to mind, and that is adoption. And so I really think that across the board, the people doing the work of equity, whether or not you're in a technical capacity, everyone doing the work needs to really adopt and understand what an equitable mindset is and how that looks in action. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we continue the conversation today. But that's something that I am really committed to doing and leading as part of my work with the MCCC and the CJ team.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you talked about action, because I think we talk a lot about equity in theory, but putting the action behind those words is extremely important. So thank you very much, Charmaine. Now I'd like to introduce Joshua Galloway with New Ecology.
Hello, thank you, Brooke. And thank you very much for having us on the panel today. New Ecology is a nonprofit with a 20-year record in Boston and Wilmington, Delaware, and Baltimore, Maryland. We strive to bring the benefits of sustainability to underserved communities, working primarily with architects, owners, and municipalities. We have a great team in that we have on board inventors, master plumbers, architects, engineers, and really strive to bring the benefits of sustainability, as I mentioned, to underserved communities through education. Next slide, please. The way we do this work is through a focus on understanding who is going to be living in these homes, and so making sure that the residents will be comfortable, rents will be, utility costs will be manageable, focusing on health. And so as you cook, whether it's on a gas stove or on an electric stove, thinking about indoor air quality. And resilience is becoming more and more of an issue. I should say it has been an issue for a long time. We are more aware of it now. And so making sure that places where we all live can still be occupied when there are extreme weather events, and we can shelter in place in our communities. And then looking at buildings as not just a place to live, but also as a contributor to carbon and climate uses. That being said, our focus or our path through this has been really focused on working with municipalities, cities, and states, and with owners and architects. And we've spent less time working directly with community groups, which we understand is really the beginning of this. I did work with Enterprise Community Partners as a Rose Architectural Fellow in Richmond, Virginia, focused on the community development process. But one of the things that we're excited to learn about today is the work that everyone is doing directly with communities. Thank you, Brooke.
Thank you, Joshua. Question for you. When you talk about equity, is it that we should be starting with the community or starting with the buildings?
Definitely starting with the community. The tricky thing as a consultant is that we are brought in by the owners or the states or the city to consult on either a large-scale resiliency plan or on a specific building. And so what we like to do is, when we start work on a building, is focus the conversation on enterprise green communities, which is a green compliance path based on community engagement. So as part of the plan, the owners and developers have to engage with the community and pull from the community information that will guide the development of the building. We realize that we're kind of, we are not in the driver's seat. And so that's one thing that we're trying to pay more attention to, is not just be beholden to whoever is paying the bills, but how the advice and efforts that we give can really be tied to that community.
Absolutely. And that goes back even to what Bernita was talking about, right, in the gaps between rents and landlords and the owners of buildings and the community. So yes, absolutely. And now I would like to hear from Sam Impink. Next slide, please.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. I'm the Chief Program Officer at the Fuel Fund of Maryland. We are a nonprofit that helps low-income families keep their lights on. We were started back in 1981 by Councilwoman Victorine Adams, who had an elderly couple in her district who had no power, and they had frozen to death. So unfortunately, because of that happening, Ms. Adams vowed it would never happen again. And she worked really hard and created the Fuel Fund of Maryland to make sure that doesn't happen again. As a nonprofit, the Fuel Fund does not receive any federal, state, or county money. All of our money is by donations. Next slide, please. Because of COVID, the Fuel Fund has changed their model a bit. We used to service just those within 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, but because of COVID, we were starting to see many families who would be over that income guidelines still need some assistance. So the Fuel Fund has opened their income guidelines, and we do not have a restriction at this time. And we also started a Silver Lights program for our seniors who are 60 plus, or those who have a critical medical need. That program was started mostly because we saw a digital divide once the state shut down for the COVID pandemic. Our seniors were having trouble applying for the state's energy assistance program because they couldn't go in person and turn all their documents in. They, excuse me, they were not able to apply online, which is where the state was referring most people. We ended up mailing out thousands of applications for the state's program to our senior clients. And we have a person, a staffer, who will help the client in any way that they need it, whether it's through mailing them information through the post office, calling them on the phone, trying to help them get through the state's program. We also saw a need for the single parent households, those people who were working full time and then their children were home doing virtual schooling. And so it was extremely important to have the power on. And so we created the Power of One program to help our single parent households. When funding is available from different foundations for this particular program, we will go ahead and pay the client's portion of the bill and get the balance down to zero to give them a fresh start. We work hard to try and get in the funding so the clients don't have to pay a portion, because everyone is still struggling. You know, as we see with inflation, the cost of everything is just extremely high. This year, we're We're launching our Stars and Stripes program, particularly for first responders and military, active duty, and veterans. We, again, based on funding availability, will go ahead and pay the client's full bill down to zero. We also have the catch-all traditional clients. Again, we work directly with BGE to help get the clients who need the help most. We are currently only able to work with those within the BGE service territory. We do help with bulk fuel. So if you heat your home with oil, propane, or kerosene, wood pellets, things of that nature, we can help with a one-time purchase. And we do that statewide. But utility assistance itself is just through the BGE service territory. You can see on your screen, if you need help, please apply. And if you would like to make a donation, please do that too. I believe it's 92 cents of every dollar goes directly to the client. So we're pretty proud of that. Thank you.
That's amazing, Sam. Thank you for that. This is definitely putting it into action, right? And you mentioned the digital divide, and you also mentioned affordability. What do you think is the biggest barrier that is facing the people who you serve in the BGE service territory?
The biggest barrier is economic inequality, I would say. Our clients just don't make enough money to cover everything, with all the expenses that they have. You know, a lot of clients will decide when they get a check, okay, this month I'm going to pay this and not BGE, or I'm going to get the medicine that I need, or put food on the table, that kind of thing. So I would say the economic inequality. And also another issue that our clients are facing is those who are eligible for the state's energy assistance program, which is run by OHEP, Office of Home Energy Program. You know, they struggle to get through that process. The state has lots of money from the federal government, so like $100 million to give out. And the process to get through that is pretty daunting. And so a lot of them end up not getting through it because it's just so arduous. So if they can make that a little bit easier, I think it would also help our clients.
Yeah, and that definitely speaks to the digital divide, right? And accessibility issues as well, of just being able to get to that money. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Keeping in the framework of providing solutions and action, I'd like to introduce Davesh Gupta from BGE.
Thank you so much, Brooke, and just really enthralled hearing all of the opportunities and things that each of the other panelists is working on in the state. Clearly, there are a lot of people thinking about equity and affordability in the state, and there needs to be a lot more of us that are getting involved for sure. I'm going to talk a little bit today first about that affordability challenge, especially in light of the energy transformation that we're moving into. You know, even today, not thinking about the energy transition, we know that underlying commodity costs are going up. Customers are being challenged by inflation at home, just generally in our industry as well. And there are a number of other things putting upwards pressure on energy bills, on energy costs for customers. And that's all before we even enter into this time period of this energy transformation. And so environmental justice is going to be important, incredibly important. But so often, environmental justice generally refers to all of the harm that's been done to communities that have been overburdened over time, when they've been forgotten. And correcting that harm, we have to make sure, as everybody on this call, as you've heard today, we have to make sure about that just transition, that we are thinking about not just remedying past wrongs for communities that have been overburdened, for those environmental justice, those Justice 40 communities, but also making sure that we don't make the same mistakes again, either overburdening those communities more in terms of their land and resources, but also individuals, right? How do we make sure that we're putting that equity lens on that transformation of the energy systems, of how we're using energy, where energy is being sourced from, so that everybody can take part and no community is being left holding the bag for a longer period of time than others that may be able to afford to make that transition more quickly. So let's talk about that a little bit today. Next slide, please. As part of our work, we had started this, we had developed our path to clean for our own operations, as well as thinking about BG's customers and the communities we serve. I guess we released it in 2021, middle of 2021. As part of that work, we had a good handle on how our own operations are going to get to net zero by a certain time, but we didn't have as good a handle on how are our customers and communities going to get there as well, in the people that are using the energy that we deliver. And so we commissioned a study by Energy and Environmental Economics, which is the same firm that the state, the Maryland Department of the Environment, has used for some of their analysis, to look specifically at BG's territory, not the entire state, but specifically at Central Maryland, where we're a dual fuel utility, gas and electric, and where our customers are a bit different than other territories, where the topography is different, the landscape. Look specifically at our area and think about what are the pathways to decarbonize. And then, so we commissioned this in December, really, of 2021 and started that work. And then in the spring of 2022 of this year, we saw the Climate Solutions Now Act passed by the legislature, which includes really ambitious goals when it comes to decarbonization. There's the 100% net zero by 2045, and there's the 60% by 2031. And really, it's that goal that's the more ambitious of the two, even, that presents more challenges of figuring out how are we going to get there and how are we going to do so equitably. And equity for us in particular was around affordability. And so we made sure that E3 was focusing on that affordability question in determining what are the different pathways to get to net zero. And so they evaluated 3 different scenarios. One was a limited gas scenario, which one might look at as an electrify everything type of scenario. And the other were more integrated energy system scenarios, thinking about, are there ways that, particularly in Central Maryland, we can leverage the gas system, right, to be part of the tools for decarbonization. Understanding that, look, no matter what the pathway is, there's going to be a lot of electrification, particularly in transportation and in buildings. Understanding that no matter what the pathway, there's going to be some reduction in natural gas use that's going to have to happen. But can you also leverage that system to think about, and the resources, the expertise that's been developed, to think about, are there ways to provide more clean fuels that are being used, that are using those systems? Are there ways to bring additional types of technologies that are not just electrified technologies to the table? And would the result be any different? So this study was actually released just this past Friday by E3 publicly. It's available on their website. We've made it available on BG's website too, and I'll drop some links in the chat for that so that everybody can review the full study. And then this morning, we also released BG's response to the study, or not really response, but our discussion of the study and what we think the right scenario is. And really, that choice for us is squarely based on equity and affordability, thinking about the challenges that our customers are going to have. No matter what the pathway is that the state chooses for decarbonization, bills are going to go up. There is going to be an affordability challenge for customers. The question is, can we mitigate that somewhat in order to pursue the most affordable transition? And we think there's a way to do that. The study from E3 seems to show that. And so we're going to promote an integrated energy system scenario. That said, we're not the decision maker in terms of the decarbonization pathway for Maryland going forward. The state may decide, no, we definitely want to go and electrify everything, a limited gas approach, in which case we'll do everything we can to make that as affordable a transition as possible. But we know from the study that's been conducted by E3 that it is going to be a more expensive solution for customers. The idea with the integrated energy system is we can pursue these other technologies, which may prove more cost effective over time. And we still maintain optionality that if a particular technology, say for heating your home, doesn't develop quickly enough, as an example, you can move to, looks like somehow, well, okay. Looks like the host stopped the video, apologies. You can move to electrify that particular area. Okay, the technologies didn't develop, let's go ahead and electrify that too. But it provides us more opportunity. There's going to be a lot of investment that needs to happen in the electric infrastructure that BGE manages across all these scenarios, as I pointed out, because of heavy electrification for transportation and for buildings, no matter what. But we're going to do all that we can to limit the affordability challenges for customers. More there to speak to that I'm not going to cover here in presenting to it. Like I said, I'll drop some links in the chat to both the E3 study as well as our own paper on that, kind of summary of it and our desired path forward. But we're going to support the state no matter what direction the state decides to go on these ambitious goals for Maryland's future. But let's talk about then, next slide, what are some of the ways that we can think about that equitable approach? And I know we're going to be speaking to this quite a bit with this panel, and I'm excited to hear from everybody here. But I just wanted to provide an example of thinking about equity, putting an equity lens on technology development. Just an example of how we can think differently about it, right? Oftentimes we think about new technologies, including electric vehicles. Everybody thinks, oh, well, it's trickle down technology, right? It's those that can afford it first are going to buy it first. And as they buy it, it's going to scale, and then it's going to become more affordable for everybody else too. And in those scenarios, it doesn't always happen soon enough. And so those that were overburdened before are again left behind until the very last minute. And what that means is they're not getting to take advantage of the lower costs of electrified transportation. Their communities aren't getting to take advantage of the lower emissions for those vehicles when they're in their neighborhoods. So is there a way that we can think about that in a different way? Instead of trickle down, think about a bottoms up approach, a rising tide lifts all boats type of approach, and look for those opportunities. Looks like I'm getting permission to start my video again too. So next slide, please. I'm just going to lay out, I'm not going to speak to all the words on the page, lay out the challenge that we saw and the opportunity that we took in a particular space with electric vehicles. Again, as an example of taking that equity lens to drive an environmental justice, a just transition approach to electrification of transportation. The Maryland PSC approved EV programs for BGE in 2019 that were proposed in January of 2018. And we were among the first states, particularly on the East Coast, to pursue a really robust portfolio of different electrification solutions. And the commission, as part of that, allowed us to construct a network, a public charging network of 500 stations around central Maryland, and to focus on places where the private investment wasn't going, right? Your Electrify Americas of the world, Teslas of the world, they were putting infrastructure in along some of our highway corridors and building that. But what about the infill areas? What about in our communities and in lower income communities and in rural communities? Was that there a role for the utility to place infrastructure there sooner in time? Because we knew it was somewhat of a chicken and an egg scenario with electrification. Do you put the charging infrastructure in first, which gets people comfortable with buying an electric vehicle? Or do you wait for them to buy the electric vehicles and then put in charging infrastructure? And the Maryland Commission said, no, let's go in and put that infrastructure in place. And to date now, we have almost half of this portfolio in place and operational of level 2 stations as well as DC fast charging stations. And you may have seen them around Maryland here and there. We're learning a lot as we're doing it. But part of the issue here is we can put the infrastructure in, but we don't want to create a bridge to nowhere, right? If we are putting this infrastructure in a limited income community, we either don't want it to go unutilized because there aren't EVs in that neighborhood, or to become a resource that's just used by transient people, by people that are coming in from, let's say, the suburbs, stopping in Baltimore City only to charge up their vehicle and heading into the city with no additional benefits for those communities. Can we involve those communities a little bit? And so we set out to think about that problem. And what we came up with is thinking about rideshare. Is there an opportunity in rideshare as one of those opportunities to start from the bottom up, where the communities that we serve can also take advantage of electric vehicles earlier in time? Next slide, please. So this solution, we first approached the Maryland Public Service Commission for permission to get into this and to develop a solution. They weren't quite comfortable there yet, right? These things are, they sometimes take other dollars in order to make these investments. And so we went out and got a DOE grant to pursue a community rideshare program. And what it was going to involve was putting 100 rideshare vehicles, rideshare EVs into the greater Baltimore region, and to upgrade the infrastructure that we were putting in to better be able to accommodate specifically rideshare vehicles that require faster chargers more often. So we got we won a DOE grant to implement the program, and we ran a competitive process to identify a partner. It ended up being that Lyft was the partner that was chosen through that program. And we've already put in to service the first 25 vehicles actually this summer, and it's gone really well. So we put them in on their Express Drive platform, which is a platform from which Lyft rents out vehicles to people that either don't own cars or don't want to drive their own cars for rideshare purposes, and lets them drive it both for personal use as well as for rideshare during the week for a discounted rate, rental rate. These 25 vehicles, since they've gone in market, are not coming back. The drivers that are taking them out don't want to give them back. They're enjoying the electrified experience, the lower cost of fuel, the easier ride quality on a long day of driving. So they're not coming back other than when they require some service or things, as happens in the normal course, right? You get a ding and dent or something in normal course driving. We're really excited about that. Supply chain challenges have created some pressure in getting the next 75 out, but we're looking for ways to get those out as soon in time as possible. As we get more of them into market, then we also want to look at opportunities to drive more equitable transportation solutions. We know that rideshares, in particular Lyft rideshares, that more than half start or end in limited income areas of our territory. And so they are providing rides to and from those spaces, but can we create affordable options for communities to, for instance, low income communities, for instance, to get to grocery stores, to get to healthcare needs, to get to jobs, right? It's not enough to do workforce development where you're teaching the skills. You also have to be able to get people to the jobs. And so we'll be pursuing those options as well. Really excited about our next set of chargers that we're hoping to electrify this month that we're putting in Johnston Square, one of those neighborhoods where we've decided to focus in Baltimore City, working with the neighborhood about what are the challenges they face and can we make them part of this energy transformation in some different ways. A few of these chargers are sited at in the parking lot of St. Francis Academy in partnership with the Maryland Department of Corrections, which the old Baltimore jail, which is being redeveloped to be a recovery center and a community center, is right in the backyard of St. Francis Academy. We had the wraps, actually. We ran a design competition with the Baltimore Design School, which is a public magnet, to have students design the wraps for those chargers too, so they could be involved, and they look beautiful, the winning students' wraps. They're ready to go. Again, supply chain, we're just waiting for a transformer in order to energize those, but those are going to be key as a location where these rideshare vehicles can go and charge, convenient to downtown, convenient to other city locations where people might be taking rides. I'm not going to go through all of the rest of the slides, but they can be available for everybody. And with that, any questions, Brooke, you have, or others as well?
Absolutely. In fact, we do have some good questions in the Q&A. And so I do think it might be a good time to take a look at those, being that we have about 15 minutes left. All right. And so one of the questions that we have is, let me see. So the actual question is, in your opinion, what is missing in Maryland to move the needle towards more meaningful engagement and empowerment of environmental justice communities and organizations so that it can be at the table of decision-making and program design? So I'm going to pose this question. Charmaine, I think this would be a great question for you as someone working with the Maryland.
Yeah, it's a great question, Brooke. I think two things. One is empowering the communities to get more involved, the people who are impacted by the decisions that some of us are fortunate to be in the decision-making seat to make. I believe that if people understand their choices, they tend to make the choices that work best for them. And there's a way that we talk about climate justice, environmental justice, decarbonization, that might alienate some people in some communities. And so I would say that we need to be as inclusive as possible in the language that we use and get more people involved who are overburdened, who understand the impacts, and who are dealing with these pocketbook and health issues every day. The other thing I believe I would love, a vision that I have, is to see businesses adopt communities where they're taking a holistic approach, looking at the ecosystem of that particular community that includes all of the aspects of climate, environmental justice, and economics, right? So a business then might help to underwrite the purchase of ZEVs. In addition to, Davesh, all of the great things that you just shared, rideshare might be appropriate for some populations, but to really look holistically, look at where you have food deserts, look at where you have these dire health impacts, right? Look at the whole community where we are doing things to educate the population, include the population in decision making, and also help the population economically to become more independent and become more empowered. So let's be inclusive. Maryland also has a number of immigrants, right? We have a number of people who are coming to the state from other countries. How culturally competent are the people doing the work? So those are just a couple of things that I would share today, but I do believe that if we give people the tools that they need, if we include them, then they have the ability to make the choices that work best for them, and that we need to be more inclusive in how we talk about these issues, because there is a tendency that some feel alienated by some of the approaches that we take. It's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question and great answer, Charmaine. And I will correct myself. I'm sorry. This session is 90 minutes, and so we're not like running low on time. So we have plenty of time to discuss this thoroughly. But you brought up some really good points, right, about our communities. And Davesh alluded to this, talking about food deserts and, how do these people, how do people even get to, obtain their basic needs? So when we talk about looking at this issue here in Maryland, I think what you brought up is something interesting because it's about diversity, right? Because if you don't have a diverse group of people working on this issue, to your point, you could be missing whole parts of the community. So I'd love to hear from some of the other panelists about how to be more inclusive when we're talking about underserved communities or communities that have barriers because of language or other issues that some of the communities may have that keep them from being able to access clean energy.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think it goes to just being very clear in some of the language that we use when we talk about these issues, as she just mentioned. So for instance, earlier when I was speaking, I used the term energy burden. That's not a term that, folks who are in these communities are familiar with. It's a term that we've developed to try to understand exactly what they're going through. But energy burden refers to the percentage of total household income that goes toward energy cost. When we talk about the energy burden, we're recognizing that families with the least means, with the least amount of money, pay disproportionately more for their electricity and for their heating, sometimes lacking basic access to service entirely. We're seeing people choose between groceries and their power bill. But we use the term energy burden as a shorthand. I think one of the easiest and most unfortunate ways that we alienate communities from these conversations is by just using those kinds of terms and not actually defining them, up front. and making sure that those terms feel tangible for them. And also making sure that folks feel comfortable revising those terms. For instance, at some point here in Georgia, we had community members say, we don't like underserved communities. We like under-resourced. What we lack is resources. For example, not all communities will say that. Some communities are fine with the term underserved. But I really think the terminology that we use and making sure that we're clear on it and that we invite dissent to those terms is extremely important in terms of how we engage in being inclusive.
That's a great point. And Sam, you brought that up about people having to choose between their basic necessities. Can you talk to us just a little bit about the background of that? So what do you think, and I think we kind of know the answer, but I'm interested in hearing from you, Sam, about the profile of the folks that you help most. What does that profile look like? Who are, when we think about whether you want to call them disadvantaged, underserved, under-resourced, the whole point is that folks are having to choose between basic living necessities out here. And these are everyday people, hardworking families. But Sam, tell us a little bit about an example of the type of folks who are in need of the most help right now.
Certainly. We have, for our traditional clients, a traditional client right now looks like average age of about 41 years old, income a little bit over 3,800 with a household size of about 2.5 people. For our Silver Lights client, our Silver Lights average age is about 67, and their income is just over 2,200, and their average size is 2 people. And then for the Power of One, the single parent household, the average age is about a 36-year-old, making just over 3,700, and average household size is about 2.7, so almost 3. And so our client, the picture of a client has actually changed since COVID. And so we are seeing a lot more people who are just making it paycheck to paycheck, barely making it. And so it is hard for our clients. If we can take the burden off of them with their bills, ironically, we have seen very large bills lately. We're talking about $5,000, $6,000 that people owe, and it's huge. And so for us, because we're a nonprofit and everything's based on donations, we typically ask them to make a payment. But on a balance of about $4,000, that client would have to make at least $2,500 as a payment. And that's probably more than most of their monthly income. So there, it's impossible for them to make that payment. And so if we can, as an organization, provide that funding so they don't have to pay it and give them a fresh start at zero, and then they can start making payments that are more manageable so their bill doesn't get back up that high. And then they can, use that money to put food on the table, to whatever they need. For our seniors, it's to pay for medications usually. And so it's really difficult sometimes, to hear the stories, of the people and, well, do I do this or do I do that? And so it's really hard when we're not able to just pay their portion, for example. And, we try really hard to, we have resources at different places in the Baltimore, Central Maryland area for clients to go, churches that may help and stuff. But it's really hard when the balances are just so incredibly high.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a stark example. I'm sure in my mind, I was thinking about these are families of 5, or more. And but these are 2 people, 2.5 people. It's very heartbreaking. But Joshua, when we talk about the fact that these bills are $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, talk to us about the building stock. Talk to us about why these bills are so high, because I'm sure, there might be folks thinking right now, like, how do you get a $5,000 bill? But it's, as we all know, it's very easy to do that. So if you can kind of shed some light on what are some of those factors, that'd be great.
Definitely. Thank you, Brooke. So it starts with the age of the building. So a lot of these buildings are 50, 80, 100 years old. A lot of the row homes we work with are solid buildings, but they're not well insulated or air sealed. And so when you don't have a means to keep the cold out or the heat out, you're turning your heat on to run all the time to try and keep it comfortable inside. And the difference is with a renovated home or a new home, you have air sealing and insulation to slow down the process of losing that heat or gaining that heat. And so what we've seen is really the importance to do deep energy retrofits in a building. They work a lot with abandoned row homes and make sure that the building envelope is really well sealed and insulated. And then it's much less expensive to heat and cool that space. It is much harder when you're working with owner-occupied homes. You don't have the ability to really take down the existing interior walls and redo them. And so I have a question back to Sam is, do you work with weatherization providers and residents to help kind of prevent from future high utility bills?
So when a client typically applies for the state's program, they can, on the application, it has a box to check for weatherization. And then if we have a client who doesn't fall within the state's guidelines, we can refer them to different programs for weatherization. But to your point, one of the issues that we often see is most of our clients are renters. And if the landlord is not willing to let them come in and do the upgrades, then they're kind of in a catch-22, they're at a loss. So unfortunately, that is one of the biggest problems that we see.
Davesh, go right ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to also add the other aspect of it, because this is something that, you know, we're talking about internally too. There are so many things that we're trying to do when it comes to the customer's energy bills, right? Their share of wallet that's being spent on their energy costs. But we also need to make sure, again, in this energy transition, this transformation, that we're looking to grow that the size of the wallet for customers too, right? That's another lever. Again, energy costs are going to go up. It's just kind of a fact of the matter. It's going to cost money for us to make this clean energy transition. It may save money in the long run. That's what we're all hopeful of. But how can we make that more affordable? Yes, we can look at bill assistance. We can look at ways of leveling out bills from month to month as well to just make it easier to manage. We can find both state and federal assistance programs, but are there ways that we can actually create more opportunities for Marylanders to be a part of the transition when it comes to jobs, workforce development? I know Exelon signed on a handful of days ago to the Biden administration's workforce development pledge, right? That's really key and important to us, is creating jobs that are in this space. I'll say I'm in the middle of right now drafting a grant for a Department of Energy program to create a workforce development program specifically around EV charger maintenance as well, to create an academy to teach those skills to people so that they can be a part of the changing economy and find this opportunity for new training, new jobs that might help them be able to increase the sizes of their wallet over time, rather than, you know, just manage the share of wallet that's going towards their energy costs. So that's something that we all have to, I think about, and we certainly don't have all the answers. But Maryland's going to have to really think long and hard about that, especially because of the leadership position that Maryland is taking among other states that are around us, right? I'm not pointing fingers to some other states, but there are other states that are easy for companies to relocate to if they just want a lower cost of energy and establish themselves there just across the border, rather than investing in Maryland. We have to figure out ways to keep those companies here despite the higher cost of energy, which we know is because of this really positive goal of greenhouse gas elimination over time. But not every company sees it that way. So how do we make sure that we're keeping those jobs here, that we're increasing the pool of jobs that's available, and that we're including Marylanders in the energy transformation in terms of job opportunities? Because there can be really great opportunities in that space.
Absolutely. And you're completely right that we have to remember that there's economic competition between Maryland and its bordering states. And energy is something that becomes part of that equation. Because if Amazon wants to open up a new warehouse, they need to know that they have not only energy available to them, but resilient, clean, and dependable energy with secondary backups and all of that. But certainly there is a connection between, we're all talking about the same thing. And what we're actually talking about is how climate change has really affected energy pricing, in volatility. All of that has to do with the fact that as climates change, for example, if it's 90 degrees in June, that means that folks are needing to turn on their air conditioning sooner. And so that creates more bills. If it is, still 32 degrees in, at the beginning of May, that means that you're heating all the way into the, starting to heat into those summer months. So it has a lot to do with climate change. And Charmaine, I thought you'd be a good person to kind of come back to and talk about when we look at Maryland's goals around, Maryland has a lot of lofty goals, but we're also fighting against climate change, right? Every single day, trying to get ahead of it. So tell us just a little bit about the commission that you're a part of how you all are influencing that change here in Maryland.
Yeah. So that's another really good question. I think the working groups, each of the working groups I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, adaptation and resiliency, education, community outreach, mitigation, and science and tech. They're really looking at all of these issues and making recommendations to the General Assembly on what we can do to mitigate the impacts of climate change, both in the short and long term. You all know the goals that Davesh mentioned earlier that Maryland has set out. So really looking very practically at people who are living, in flood zones and helping them to understand what they need to do in order to mitigate against some of the extreme weather impacts, whether it's, transitioning the school buses to electrification of the buses, looking at the communities in terms of who we would prioritize. And then, of course, science and tech and education and outreach, really getting the community involved and going to the community. So we come up with plans every year that we then propose to the Assembly. And those plans, as I said, are developed by experts in each of those work groups. And then the climate justice team makes recommendations on the equity piece. I do want to mention, Brooke, as we just had this conversation, Joshua talked about the aging housing stock, and you mentioned the impact of climate change on heating needs as well as air conditioning needs. I do want to, and I don't know who the best person is to respond to this, but as we are coming up on the colder months, and perhaps Sam, and the tendency for families who don't have adequate heating to maybe go out and buy these space heaters. I'm sure you all remember last year what happened in New York. Whole community of Gambian immigrants were, killed, lots of children based on these space heaters. So, I love this conversation we're having, and I would also love for us to just think about some of the really practical things that we're about to come up on, and how we can help families and protect families who may become victim of, similar tragedies because they're trying to stay warm and just have the basics. So if there's anything that we can share that would be additional resources to those families, I would love to hear. But hopefully, Brooke, I've answered your question around what the commission is doing. As I said, the 4 work group leaders are really leading the charge there, and then the CJ team, helping to apply the equity lens and bring tools like the screening tools, the EJ team, the environmental justice screening tools as part of the evaluation of where we can be more effective.
Thank you, Charmaine. And yeah, we'll let Sam address your question.
Thank you. I do want to, before I answer that question, mention that, the summer heating is also an issue for clients, right? You know, we always hear and talk about people who, you know, like in New York or how the fuel fund was started, people freeze to death, but, you know, people can die in heat-related deaths as well. And we actually had an elderly woman this year whose heat was off, and she was lying on her wood floors to keep herself cool until we got the bill paid. And so I just want to remind folks that, you know, heat-related deaths also are an issue. But with the winter season coming up, I know, and maybe Davesh can speak to this, that BGE has more steps to take before they can actually disconnect someone when I believe it's November 1st is when that winter stuff takes effect. And so they're less likely to turn off as many people as they have been. But for clients who are service off in the winter, you know, we ask them to, you know, get in touch with us right away. And if we have the funding, boom, we'll help them get restored so there are no issues, particularly if it's a senior or there's a health-related issue in the household. A lot of our clients will tell us that they, you know, we always hear about bundling up, putting on layers, and families, you know, with children, especially, they huddle together. We tell clients, no candles, don't turn your stove on, things of that nature. We hear that every winter. I've been keeping warm by turning my stove on, and you know, we just kind of cringe every time we hear that, and we do our best to get it taken care of. I hope that answered your question, Charlene.
Davesh, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, Brooke, I'll just respond. I wish I was the expert with more information around disconnection procedures, Sam, and those are all certainly managed by the rules that are and laws that are in place. But we can definitely get additional answers if you'd like us to.
Yeah, great. And Davesh, we have a question specifically for you. It says, for public charging stations in lower income and rural communities, have you considered putting in energy storage microgrid, solar capabilities to act as resiliency hubs for these communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the challenges with our putting out our public charging network that was approved by the commission is that the budget is limited. Including in terms of the fast charging technology that we can include, which it was budgeted for only 50 kW fast chargers, which was a technology that was the fastest at the time in 2018 when we filed our plan. Though now we know that fast charging technology goes up to 150 and 350, which is why we went out and got DOE funding for that community grant program, the community charging and rideshare program, to bridge the cost difference between the 50 kW and the 150 kW. That's now the new technology. And the same is true then of these other really interesting ways to create resiliency hubs. I will say this, my team is very actively looking for those opportunities for federal funding, particularly through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, to see if there are opportunities to create those equitable multimodal hubs where we can not only make resilient charging hubs, but also find additional ways to involve the community, whether it's through micromobility, car shares, having better shelters for public transportation stops and things at those hubs as well. So we are looking for those opportunities, but the funding wasn't there provided by the state. So we're having to look elsewhere in order to try and roll out that type of technology. But we've identified some technology vendors are looking for those federal funding opportunities to pursue that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a huge proponent of resiliency centers, and there are several barriers that happen that don't allow for it because it's expensive, right? To have redundant power, to have many sources of power, to have microgrids. And one of the biggest issues that we run into, right, is space and land. We need space and land to be able to put a solar farm or, to put a battery. And the cost of land, as we all know in Maryland, especially as you get closer to DC or on the borders of Virginia, especially, the land is so expensive that, you can't even afford to put energy on it. And so at some point, we have to find ways to overcome the financial barriers, right, that we all face in looking for renewable energy, because it's surely not from lack of want and need for renewables. And I think, Joshua, you brought this up. You brought up the word resiliency first in our conversation. Resiliency is not easy to obtain. And so when we talk about being equitable, right, it's really, really hard to be equitable with resiliency because of the cost barriers. So can you talk just a little bit to clarify that, or what are some of those barriers to resiliency?
Yes, thank you, Brooke. Resiliency hubs are often combined with a community center. And so it's something that will provide power and cooling, heating, refrigeration for medication. So all the things that we need to live our lives. And I think that the challenges are the space and cost. What we're seeing now is that some municipalities and states are requiring resiliency hubs to be built into new communities or renovated communities. And so I think that is a great way to for this to happen, is for it to be required. The other thing pieces is just infrastructure. And so if there's not enough infrastructure in terms of an electrical capacity for a building to switch over to electrification for an all electric building, to then be able to have a resiliency hub, that's a big challenge. And then just education, I think, is one of the biggest things, is that we hear a lot about resilience and resiliency hubs, but there's not a lot of places you can go and see built examples and really understand how it works.
Exactly.
Thinking about the practical solution side, Brooke, again, to resiliency and thinking about that issue of equity, part of Climate Solutions Now Act was a school bus program, which was $50 million in incentives for each utility to provide to school districts to electrify their school buses, with the hook that the utility can then use those buses, which are really just large, very large batteries on wheels, for resiliency needs. And we plan to file our plan on how we're going to use our $50 million in incentives and how we're going to use those buses for resiliency needs, hopefully by the end of this year. And one of the things that we're looking at, Josh, is specifically, can these buses be used as rolling batteries to send out to those community centers where the infrastructure may not be there, the rooftop space may not be there, but when we know an event is going to happen, or we know an event has happened, can we roll that bus out there for that community center to plug into so that it can provide all of that resiliency benefit to the community? Heating, cooling, refrigeration, all of the charging your necessities, right? Your cell phones and other electronic equipment today. Can we use those in that way, rather than just the traditional way that some utilities have been thinking about using these, which is just plugging them into the system in order to provide battery services to keep the system upgraded? Can we use them in this way creatively, where if one is then running low, we can send another one out, and the one that's running low can come back and charge where there is power and there is infrastructure already to get it charged up. So we're trying to think creatively about leveraging these solutions that are being provided by the state in the most equitable ways that we can, to provide direct benefits to customers.
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you for answering that. And we have some more questions in the Q&A, so I'll go back to the Q&A. This is an interesting question. So BEPS is in Montgomery County, and this is building performance, right? So is it changing the equation of landlord accountability? I'm going to give this to Bernita. Bernita, BEPS is really looking at building standards and holding buildings to certain standards. Do you feel that by whether it be a county or the state holding buildings accountable for a certain standard, do you think that helps at all with the equation on landlord accountability?
Yeah, absolutely, because it goes straight to the issue of weatherization. As I mentioned earlier, landlords should be held responsible for weatherizing these buildings, making sure they're sealed up properly, insulated properly, to reduce people's energy bills, to reduce their energy usage. What kind of incentives are necessary to actually get landlords to do some of that work, considering that they're not living in those homes and paying those bills, really is the question. But absolutely, if we're talking about building standards as it relates to weatherization, absolutely necessary. But that said, weatherization has to go beyond, and building standards have to go beyond just sort of, sealing things up, making sure things are insulated and so forth. It has to also include incentivizing these landlords to invest in more efficient furnaces and so forth, that can go further to reduce energy usage and utility bills. I think from just a general standpoint, a lot of these issues around landlord accountability really go to habitability of the units. And I don't know if we actually talk about it enough that way. When do we get to a point where a building, an apartment building, is so energy inefficient that it questions the habitability of the building? That's a very important question I think we all need to be considering. I also think it's a very important space for legal aid attorneys to come in and provide some insights about what they're seeing from their clients on the ground related to these properties.
Yeah, energy is at some point a basic human right to have access to clean energy, and to live in a home, wherever you live, whether you live in an apartment or a single home, that is efficient enough so that you can adequately survive. Because otherwise, you're forced to. We talked about space heaters. We talked about all these things that people have to do just to stay warm or to cool themselves. And there are many landlords out there who are not making the investment in energy, but it is truly a human right. And I'm sure we all agree with that. Sam, why don't you give us your input on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, it would be nice if there was also a way that when a landlord does allow weatherization or there is an upgrade to buildings and such, that they don't then just, totally increase the rent to where it's unmanageable for that particular client, because now it's an energy efficient home. So I think we would need to also want to figure out a way to, balance that out. So the rent right now is skyrocketed to begin with. And so for a lot of people, they struggle just to pay the rent. And so I would want to be careful of that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's a really ugly cycle, right? That a building needs weatherization and needs improvements. But then once it's made, the landlord feels like, oh, my building's worth so much more, let me raise rents. And then that goes to the people who are renting can't afford to pay it. And then it just kind of, it ends up being a really nasty cycle. We have another question here that I think is really, really important. And so can you address the problem of air pollution due to fossil fuel combustion as a contributor to health disparities as a reason to invest in electrification and weatherization in low and moderate income neighborhoods? So this is a really important issue as we talk about the fact that most of the dirty energy in the world is located in the poorest parts of the world. And the cleanest energy is available to the wealthier parts of the world. And this is tied directly to health disparities. And so, for example, children having asthma the asthma rates are through the roof because of the fact that we have so many fossil fuels, especially in areas where children are vulnerable. And so this is a very big issue. There's also, there's many issues related to air pollution, and it goes right along with climate change, some of the other things that we were discussing. Does anyone from the panel would like to address the health disparities in this issue?
I mean, I'll point out, Brooke, even in our planning discussions, as we think about the benefits cost analysis for pursuing certain investments and not others, this isn't taken into account strongly enough, right? In terms of thinking about benefits costs differently so that we can invest differently, prioritize investments differently. I think we are There's definitely more discussion around it. It's definitely has more of a seat at the table than it did before. But those calculations that are used to determine whether investments are the right investments still need to take better accountability for the health and wellness benefits. And there's definitely a challenge, and we can do some of the improvements through, for instance, transportation electrification for the localized emissions from vehicles and things. But we do have to clean that generation stack behind. The nice part is you put an electric vehicle on the road, it should be getting cleaner over time, right? As more and more of the generation becomes renewable or nuclear, or whatever those opportunities may be, carbon sequestration. I don't know where the technologies are going to go, but we do have to focus on cleaning up those generation stacks too. Right now, I think I mentioned in chat, BG is not allowed to own and operate generation in the state. And so we are trying to figure out ways that we can encourage that cleaning of the generation that is supplying our customers, for those that cannot choose who their, or aren't choosing who their energy supplier is, or can't, or have been burned and don't want to, whatever the case may be, that more of those electrons that are being delivered are being delivered from clean sources. But there's a limitation to how much we ourselves can do at this time.
Yes. This has been a wonderful discussion. Can I turn it back over to you, Kathy?
Yes, Brooke, thank you, and thank the panel. Just some wrap-up thoughts from where I sit. And there, I want to say that, just an observation, there's so much discussion going on in the chat and in the Q&A that is really relevant to what we're talking about. As we talk about this topic, I think that it's important that we find a way to agree on how to define the audience that we are talking about here. Equity means different things, right? There's elderly populations who have equity issues. There are first language limited people that we've talked about before, veterans. And there was a question raised about what are some of the pitfalls we need to avoid in engaging this audience. So how do we define it and how do we engage the audience? Then there's the discussion about top-down versus bottom-up solutions. It's easy to look at how we implement solutions from one perspective, but how do we engage the audience and the community in being part of developing and buying into those solutions? And that's a challenge because generally the audience that we're talking about is struggling with paying for things. They're working, their transportation issues to get to meetings. So that outreach and that dedicated effort at outreach is really an important strategy. The third thing that I wanted to raise was energy literacy, that we see this across the board, not just with low to moderate income or overburdened, underserved communities, but people who are general population, moderate income or upper income. Energy literacy is something that we need to address collectively to be able to have this discussion effectively across the board. One of the questions raised in the chat was, what is MCEC doing about this? And I wanted to take a minute just to address some of the work that we are doing. I want to point our audience to the Clean Energy Advantage Loan Program that was introduced in March of this year, which provides low-cost lending capital to homeowners in Maryland to make energy improvements on their homes, that is also backed with the Empower ratepayer surcharge funds. The loans are not income specific, they are credit worthy. We go down to a 640 credit score, and you can find information about that on our website. And these loans can be tied to the Empower incentives. We are also looking at how do we deploy MCEC in this space through the Climate Catalytic Capital Fund that was authorized in the Climate Solutions Now Act in the most recent General Assembly session. 40% of the funds dedicated for that purpose are required to be used to assist low to moderate income households and communities. And we are looking at partnering those funds with federal resources coming through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Green Bank strategies that we'll be deploying there. That's all under development right now, but suffice to say that the federal funds also are tied to a Justice 40 goal for addressing the needs of underserved and overburdened communities in Maryland and in the country. So lots of work to be done, lots of partnerships to facilitate, and I want to thank this panel for their efforts and their work that they do in this space. I suspect this will be not be the only conversation that we have about this topic, and we invite you to stay engaged. We're grateful for our audience joining us today. As you exit the webinar, please take a minute to answer a couple of the questions and share your feedback. We want you to help MCEC plan for future programs and educational content. As a reminder, the recording of today's program will be posted online shortly afterwards at www.mdcleanenergy.org/speaker series. And we invite you to join us again for the upcoming programs listed on your screen. We'll be approaching the end of the series, and there are only 2 programs. On October 25th, there will be 2. Our next program, October 18th, looks at carbon reduction strategies and the potential for net zero emission credits. Thanks again, everybody. Great panel. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.